Rhine River. Its shimmering waters nourish thriving vineyards, while from its shores, majestic castles lord over every twist and bend. Join us on a journey into Germany's rich medieval past. A voyage through legend on the world's most romantic river, the Rhine. Next on Great Castles of Europe. Formed by melting snowfields high in the Swiss Alps, the mighty Rhine carves an 800-mile channel through the heart of Europe. In the Low Countries, it rushes to the sea. Its name comes from the Celtic word for stream, a vast understatement of the romance and power of this mighty river. Writers from Goethe to Mark Twain have tried to capture the Rhine's epic spirit. In 1838, the French novelist Victor Hugo wrote that the Rhine combines everything, winding as the Seine, historic as the Tiber, royal as the Danube, covered with phantoms and fables like a river of Asia. But unlike rivers of any other region, the Rhine is studded with dozens of medieval castles, making it a showplace of antiquity, unequaled in the world. In the 50-mile stretch between Mainz and Koblenz, Germany, some 30 castles and ruins tower above the river's edge. Every bend and coil in the snaking waterway seems to reveal another. Rhine travelers not only get a journey through Europe's heart, but backwards through time itself. These spectacular vistas have survived virtually unchanged since the Middle Ages. By the 13th century, the Rhine had developed into a vital commercial waterway. Its shores were governed by noblemen and Catholic clergy, bitter rivals who fought over every inch of land, especially riverfront property. There, huge profits could be made by erecting toll stations and charging hefty fees for the safe passage of ships. The right to operate a toll castle could be awarded only by the regional lord or the German king, usually in exchange for money or political favors. Merchants had no choice but to pay the charge. Moving their cargo overland was a more dangerous and often deadly ordeal. Here at the city of Kaub, the Rhine narrows like an hourglass, making it an ideal spot for a toll castle. This ship-like fortress was erected by King Ludwig the Bavarian in 1326. He named it Pfalzgrafenstein. More lyrically, Victor Hugo would call it a stone ship eternally anchored at the face of the city. But in the 14th century, the powerful Catholic Church regularly shipped goods along the Rhine. They took a dimmer view. Pope John XXII condemned King Ludwig for new and severe impositions for those passing with goods. In 1327, the Bavarian king suffered the ultimate revenge. The Pope excommunicated him. Despite its jaunty nautical appearance, the castle Pfalzgrafenstein was built for extortion. No royal personage ever took residence here. Instead, a regiment of some 30 soldiers kept a round-the-clock vigil. Watchmen announced approaching ships by ringing a bell. The castle's toll rider would board each vessel, examine its cargo, and assess the toll. To keep boats from slipping by unchecked, a canal on the Rhine's east side forced them to pass next to the castle. For merchants trying to run the gauntlet, a watery grave awaited. Huge stones hurled from catapults rained down on them. Cannons aimed through gun ports could target every inch of the river. Here on the castle's west side, the Rhine is rocky. In addition, a heavy chain stretched across the river's width. Wayward ships stranded here were sitting ducks. The troops stationed at Pfalzgrafenstein did all their fighting from a distance. Their ranks were made of cripples and retirees. Accommodations in the castle were also second-rate. All walkways connecting the castle rooms are exposed to the elements. Garrison quarters inside are Spartan but functional. Built into a watchtower suspended over the Rhine, this rudimentary toilet empties straight into the water. The ship-like Volksgrafenstein heads ceaselessly into the current, but its seafaring design was only partly for show. 6 watchtowers add strength to its river-battered ramparts. Its bow continues to protect the toll castle from rising currents and ice flows even today. The Rhine's history is inextricably linked with the fruit for which it became famous. Succulent wine grapes probably grew wild in this valley long before mankind learned of their giddy magic. As early as the time of Christ, Rhine wine was shipped to discriminating consumers as far off as England and Scandinavia. In time, the nectar of the vine made this valley rich. Or rather, it enriched those who owned the toll castles and vineyards. To further line their coffers, these rulers taxed the peasants who worked their fields. Commoners handed over the lion's share of everything they produced, a tariff usually paid in wine. As for the peasants, the wine they manufactured gave them cause to celebrate, socialize, and forget. Medieval peasant life often consisted of grueling poverty broken only by bloody wars. Relief came in the form of religion and a frequently raised goblet in the company of friends. The commoner's average wine consumption topped 4 liters a day. The popular intoxicant became the accepted payment for all river tolls. 1 barrel of wine was worth 16 pounds of garlic or grapes, or 6 baskets of fish. Its use as a standard of exchange accounts in part for Rhine wine's development into a thriving industry. As wine became the favorite currency of kings, castle wine cellars filled to overflowing. But with the frequent festivities and celebrations that characterized Rhine court life, these vast supplies quickly ran out again. In addition to fine wines, the Rhine gave birth to epics of heroism and valor. At a place called Dragon's Rock, the legendary Prince Siegfried used an enchanted sword to slay a fire-breathing beast. By bathing in the monster's blood, the prince became invincible. Wagner's famous opera, Ring of the Nibelung, immortalizes the hero, killed finally through the cunning of the jealous Queen Brunhild, who perished with him. To this day, the Lower Rhine's red wine bears the name Dragon's Blood. This region of the Rhine got its name from another tale of feminine guile and the supernatural. Here, the scenic Rhine curves sharply, and the swift current grows treacherous. Steep rocks jut skyward from the river's edge. Upon these rocks, according to legend, a woman of otherworldly beauty materialized each evening. Her name was Lorelei, and her sweet, plaintive song deafened boatmen to the river's thundering roar. When the men regained their senses, it was too late. They could no longer steer clear of the rocks, nor keep the jealous waves from swamping their boats. And the beautiful Lorelei, over the cries of drowning sailors, she continued her siren chanting until the morning sun chased off the night. Travel down the Rhine River today is a floating lesson in medieval rivalry. At every curve, another castle appears high atop the riverbanks. Each represents a landlord's claim to all the territory below. Two castles in particular illustrate the shifting balance of power that once characterized the mighty river region. The castle Teurenberg on the Rhine's east bank was built by the Archbishop of Trier around 1356. Not to be outdone by a churchman, his neighbors, the wealthy Counts von Katzenelnbogen, erected their own castle on the opposite hill. These powerful merchants were already the proud owners of 138 villages. Although they named their new prize the Burg nor Katzenelnbogen, it came to be known as the Burg Katz, or Cat's Castle. Predictably, the first castle, the Teurenberg, was then nicknamed Burg Maus, Mouse Castle. Thus, the antagonism between merchants of great wealth and the all-powerful Catholic Church resembled a game, a cat-and-mouse rivalry that continued through the ages. When they weren't baiting one another or pressing their vassals into service, the lords of the Rhine passed leisurely days with pleasant diversions. Favorite at the Burg Maus was hunting, using falcons and eagles, a blood sport that originated in the Orient. Survivors of the Crusades and well-traveled merchants like the Katzenelnbogen counts brought falcons and falconers to Europe and the British Isles. There, the sport thrived among the privileged classes. The quarry these eagles are after are pigeons and other small birds. On the winds of the twisting Rhine Valley, they will soar indefinitely before diving after prey or returning to their master's glove. Opposite the cat-and-mouse castles near the village of St. Goar lie the ruins of the once glorious and powerful Rheinfels castle. The Rheinfels was also constructed by the powerful Counts von Katzenelnbogen, who for years used it as their main residence. During an invasion by the French in the late 18th century, peasants with a centuries-old gripe against its owners burned it. A few miles downriver, on the east bank of the Rhine, a high, cone-shaped hill rises above the quiet hamlet of Braubach. The castle crowning the hill has an unusually slender keep, towering above its attendant courts and ramparts. While it is a massive and presumably easy target, this castle alone among the Rhine landmarks has remained unscathed by enemy attacks. This is the Marksburg. For stability, the Marksburg's walls are triangular and built so close to the hill's edge that in places it's hard to see where the rocks end and the walls begin. Old foundations reveal that the citadel began as a fortified tower, probably built by the 10th century Franks. The Roman-styled central tower was built about 200 years later. Subsequent owners of the Marksburg erected an additional defensive wall. Unlike other castles, the Marksburg has survived into the 20th century as more than a ruin or a romantic restoration. Despite additions in the 17th and 18th centuries, its medieval character has been magnificently preserved. The landlord who erected the main buildings in the 13th century was called Eberhard von Katzenelnbogen, another count from the family whose vast influence shaped the history of the Middle Rhine. A canny businessman and trader, he shared his prosperity with the city of Braubach. The castle gave the town much-needed employment and, most of all, protection. This vital function of all medieval castles was acknowledged throughout the continent by friend and foe alike. In a statement of détente between church and state, the Archbishop of Cologne wrote, "Our cities show that their life and belongings are linked with the decline of the castle." Count Eberhard's generosity at Marksburg was not purely one-sided. He could order Braubach workers to the castle whenever their services were needed. For Eberhard's court, access to the castle on horseback was a strict necessity. Because of their heavy armor, knights of the era couldn't dismount without help. Without armor, they weren't so encumbered. Marksburg's main entrance was carved out of the slate rock of the mountain itself. Rough-hewn steps prevented horses from slipping during rains. At the end of this stairway lies the Roman Palace, the castle's oldest building. Marksburg's central courtyard is remarkably narrow, crowded by the massive Roman tower at its center. Surrounding the courtyard is the Gothic palace built at the end of the 15th century. The palace's sharp roof is protected with slate, excavated for the castle's foundation. Under the castle's second tower lies the spacious Rittersaal, the Knights' Hall and main living room where official receptions took place. Here Count Eberhard entertained and plotted with the region's noblemen. The hall's massive wall is 10 feet thick, sturdy enough for even the most determined onslaught by catapult or cannon. Adjoining the Knights' Hall, inside the second tower, is a striking polygonal chapel, spanned by groined vaulting in 10 sections. Colorful biblical scenes compete overhead with flattering portraits of knights. The chapel originally was constructed on the east side of the castle. Later it was moved to the castle's south side, its most vulnerable face. God, its builders reasoned, would protect his sanctuary. To help transfer the Holy Spirit to the new chapel site, these ceremonial heads were also moved. They represent the 7 deadly sins, expiated only through prayer. This portrait depicts St. Mark. He played a vital role in the legend that gave the fortress its name. Long ago, Elizabeth, a maiden of the castle, became secretly engaged to a knight called Sigbert. When Sigbert went to war on behalf of his king, Elizabeth waited for him, but in vain. Word came that in a gruesome battle, her beloved had been killed. In her grief, Elizabeth was comforted by a stalwart monk called Marcus. Soon a mysterious knight named Rochus appeared, asking for Elizabeth's hand. Reluctantly, she agreed to be wed, and the kingdom celebrated the nuptials, all except for the monk Marcus. He was suspicious of the mysterious Rochus and prayed for guidance. On the night before the wedding, Marcus had a strange and disturbing vision. In a flash of blinding light, St. Mark the Apostle appeared. Giving Marcus a cross, he told the loyal monk that Rochus was the devil himself. He must be banished from the castle. In the morning, Rochus and Elizabeth were to come to the chapel. Marcus waited for just the right moment. The demon screamed. Beneath him, the earth opened wide. The Apostle Mark appeared once again to protect the mortals with a holy sword. Since that day, Schloss Braubach has borne the name of the saint, Marksburg. Centuries later, in 1937, St. Mark made another appearance at the castle. An American tourist paused to take a snapshot near a chapel window. When the film was developed, this ghostly portrait emerged. Perhaps it was the vigilant St. Mark still defending the Marksburg. In the 14th century, the already formidable influence of the von Katzenelnbogen family grew unchecked. Their toll castles choked the Rhine from Mainz to the Dutch border. The Marksburg was just one of dozens. Chief of the von Katzenelnbogen clan was Philip the Elderly, an adventurous, if aged, bon vivant. Even in his twilight years, he craved parties, the hunt, and adventure. Yet at home, Philip was locked in a stormy marriage to Anna von Württemberg. Perhaps this accounts for his far-ranging travels to exotic cities in Africa and China. Eventually, Philip sent Anna to one of his distant castles. Later, he divorced her. At the time, divorce was such a sensitive matter that the church reserved it for the rich and mighty. One of Philip's sons was murdered by a robber. The other succumbed to a mysterious disease. Philip, at 72, faced his life's greatest challenge, producing a new heir. He married once more to another Anna, this one from the von Braunschweig family. She was just 20 years old. But the union was fruitless, and when he died in 1479, there was no male von Katzenelnbogen to carry on the family name. His beloved castle Marksburg fell into the hands of his son-in-law, Heinrich von Hessen. But with their own castle far away, the von Hessens had only a fleeting interest in the Marksburg. They visited long enough to pay their respects to the fallen lord, then stripped the castle of its valuables, including Philip's extensive library and treasures of silver and gold. Still seeking profit in the majestic relic, they built an outer defensive wall and leased the castle as a troop garrison. No nobleman would ever live here again. Marksburg's years as a regal showplace had ended. An era had come to a close. The decline of all the great Rhine castles began in earnest shortly after, as the 16th century got underway. With the region shattered by wars, many castles were crippled or destroyed. Their once mighty ramparts and towers were no match for the explosive weapons of the frightening New Age. Yet perhaps due to its fearsome appearance and the knowledge that its new cannon batteries were trained constantly on the world below, the Marksburg was left in peace. Only recently, after more than 1,000 years unscathed, did the great castle endure its darkest moments. In 1945, while occupied by retreating German troops, it came under American grenade fire. Its wounds, however, were minor. Perhaps once more, St. Mark lent a hand in protecting the stronghold, leaving the greatest treasure of the Rhine intact to this day. Today, the Rhine region hosts adventurers of a different sort. Still proud castles are now home to hotels where travelers can bask in an era of knights, scoundrels, and legends. But the best views are still from the water. Boats navigate a course unchanged by time. Only the panorama changes, as the gently snaking valley reveals one treasure after another, and history is turned back by the ceaseless current of the Rhine. It's been called a madman's folly and the fairy tale palace of a king. It was a lonely prince's obsession and may have brought about his doom. To step into these halls is to visit a soul touched by insanity or tragic genius. The outrageous, unmistakable Neuschwanstein, next on Great Castles of Europe. In the Bavarian Alps of southern Germany, nature carves fortresses of woodland and stone. Today, from these alpine crags rises an improbable fantasy, more like ivory than alabaster, more dreamlike than real, an architectural marvel that inspired Walt Disney's Cinderella Castle. But this castle's story ends in sorrow. It is Neuschwanstein, one of the most enigmatic creations ever built by man. Since its construction more than a century ago, it has been despised and praised, declared an eyesore and a wonder. Its history is about the journey that begins once childhood ends, and a Bavarian prince who didn't know the difference. Ludwig II, Bavaria's king from 1864 to 1886. His subjects revered him as their fairy tale king, but history derides him as Mad King Ludwig, a legend or a lunatic. The truth lies somewhere between. The story of Bavaria's controversial king begins above the village of Schwangau, in the castle Hohenschwangau. It's separated from Neuschwanstein by just a few hundred yards, and the painful memories of a childhood spent alone. It was there in 1845 that Ludwig was born to Bavaria's Crown Prince Maximilian and his wife Marie. She was a dedicated alpine climber with little interest in rearing children. He was a biologist who knew a lot about science, but nothing about raising a king. From his earliest days at Hohenschwangau, Ludwig's hungry mind was steeped in romantic fantasy. The castle had been built by the Knights of Schwangau, heroic warriors and minstrels who had all died out by the 16th century. Yet their likenesses and legends rounded out young Ludwig's empty world. His mother sent away playmates of inferior breeding. The young prince grew up alone amid the castle's cool splendor. To Ludwig, its grand apartments seemed stale as prison towers. There by the hour, pious tutors filled his head with church rhetoric, when it was the knights of a lost romantic time who had captured his heart. As he grew, Ludwig discovered another kingdom lying just beyond the castle walls, the magnificent Bavarian Alps. From their heights, Hohenschwangau was a distant dream. During far-ranging climbs and long horseback rides, Ludwig found solace in nature's serenity. He cherished the company of local farmers. He'd maintain these attachments for the rest of his life. Soon, the prince met the companion who would influence him most, literature. In the dramas of von Schiller, he found voice for his idealism and solitary longing. If escape were possible from the disappointing world, it was through the door thrown open by the Romantics. Enraptured by nature and legends of heroic deeds, Ludwig felt he was headed for a life of greatness. Instead of resenting his royal blood, he looked forward to someday taking the throne. By now, the young dreamer had met Richard Wagner and bought all his compositions. A great Wagnerian score would accompany the drama of Ludwig's life. But for the romantic prince, on the eve of a grand crusade, his day came much too soon. On March 10, 1864, Maximilian II died. Ludwig was thrust onto the throne. He knew nothing about the world and less about politics. Yet more than anyone, he understood the sacredness of his position, his legacy to uphold. He would offer his people a hero. But the government only wanted a figurehead, a king in name alone. With deep resentment, the king returned to Hohenschwangau. There he received heads of state, including Otto von Bismarck, whose career would launch the fortunes of Germany. His celebrity won Ludwig a passel of female admirers. Some were said to fall in love with the king at first sight. He became engaged to a young Bavarian princess. Fondly, he nicknamed her Elsa, after the heroine of Wagner's opera, Lohengrin. Commemorative coins were ordered and a wedding coach for two. But Ludwig backed out. He was rarely seen in women's company again. Failed in politics and now romance, a challenge lay before the chastened king to reawaken his power to dream. With his great family fortune, he began a castle of dreams on a plateau where two ancient citadels overlooked his ancestral home. 450 tons of cement, 465 tons of Salzburg marble, 500,000 bricks. It would take an army of men 17 years, starting in 1869. Even before it was complete, it was clear this would be no castle at all. It would be a fabulous monument to Romanticism and a shrine for Ludwig's hero, a man the king called king, Richard Wagner. The castle in the sky would be a paradise befitting a chivalrous knight, soaring high above the tawdry world below. There, only noble instincts would prevail. There, truth and beauty would reign. He dubbed it Neuschwanstein, New Swan's Castle. More than 60 feet long, its magnificent throne room was a rebuke to Ludwig's detractors in Parliament. 50 feet overhead, its ceiling is a star-filled heaven, while between heaven and earth floats this gold-plated chandelier. It's cast in the shape of a royal crown. This crown was very heavy indeed, loaded with 96 candles and lowered with a winch. It weighs nearly a ton. God appoints kings, is this great hall's meaning. Kings intercede between heaven and earth. Ludwig longed for a return to an absolute monarchy. But significantly, the throne, which would have been placed here, is missing. Christ and his apostles seem to look on in holy judgment. As the castle neared completion, few people but Ludwig and one or two intimates ever set foot inside. Yet during its construction, the king spent many hours here in his customary solitude. As he turned his back on government duties, tensions with Parliament grew. Bavaria's clergy and narrow-minded aristocracy complained about the money he was spending on Wagner. After meeting his idol in 1864, Ludwig moved him to Munich and supported him lavishly. Finally, in a newspaper, Ludwig's enemies accused Wagner of sedition. This image of a plague, this paid music maker, this man has the intention of isolating the king and exploiting him for the treasonable ideas of a revolutionary party. In less than 2 years, these attacks forced the king to make Wagner leave Bavaria. "You have to believe me," Ludwig wrote the composer. "I had to act like this. My love for you is eternal." For Ludwig, this was a turning point. The mantle of his office was becoming unbearably heavy, and the rift of trust between Bavaria's government and its king widened into a chasm. In Neuschwanstein's Singers' Hall, Ludwig made good on his pledge to Wagner. Designed for operas that would never break its stillness, the hall is decorated with scenes from the legend of Parsifal, the epic poem of knighthood that inspired Wagner's greatest opera. Theater painters created this artwork following Ludwig's specifications. Here, Parsifal does battle with the Red Knight. King Ludwig might have identified with the romantic hero's ordeal. His enemies weren't through with him yet. Echoed also in the Singers' Hall is the swan motif, important both to the Parsifal legend and to the king. Swan Lake lay outside his childhood home. By naming his lofty retreat Neuschwanstein, Ludwig meant to give it the qualities the swan possessed in German mythology. The swan represents what is holy and pure, free of the earth, and so not of the earth. In his anguish, Ludwig wrote to Wagner, "Oh, how futile is this world, how miserable, how cruel so many men. Their lives are centered in the close circle of triviality. Oh, if only this world lay behind me." Swans are also famous for their metamorphosis. Their brown offspring molt and turn blindingly white, pure. Now reaching middle age, King Ludwig's transformation went the other way. Artwork in the king's living room picks up where the Parsifal legend leaves off. In Wagner's opera Lohengrin, Parsifal asks his son to defend Elsa of Brabant. All behold the miracle of the Holy Grail, visible only to those who are pure in spirit. Wagner never laid eyes on the shrine Ludwig had created for him at Neuschwanstein. Banished from Bavaria, he never once set foot inside. But through letters, he kept in touch with his former patron. To a friend, he wrote, "The king is unfortunately so noble and brilliant, so magnificent and soulful, that I fear his life must vanish like a fleeting stream in this coarse world." Wagner might have feared for the young king's mind had he seen this. Between the living room and the study, Ludwig built a cave, another scene from another of the master's operas, this from Tannhauser, about a German minstrel and crusader. Now, even Ludwig's beloved subjects referred to him as the fairy tale king. Obesity had begun to corrupt his good looks. He grew addicted to drugs prescribed by doctors for chronic insomnia and excruciating toothaches. His weight kept him from riding and hiking. He withdrew from friends, the local farmers, and worse, his beloved Alps. Members of Ludwig's family wondered about his sanity. His devotion to literature, here the Germanic saga of Siegfried, took on the pall of an obsession. Madness, it was said, ran in his blood. His brother Otto would spend years in an asylum. His aunt Alexandra maintained a lifelong conviction that she had swallowed a glass piano. Ludwig's eccentricities breathed life into the rumors. Sleigh rides under the cover of night were the king's response to his increasingly painful shyness. At Neuschwanstein, the king retreated to a box inside a box, his fantastically elaborate bedroom. There he regularly slept away the day, rising only when the moon was high to haunt the fantastic halls no one else could see. As early as the 1870s, the royal family had seen enough. They began measures to have Ludwig declared insane. The king, they reasoned, was no longer fit to wear the crown of Bavaria, figurehead or not. Their real concerns were less patriotic. The titanic amounts of money Ludwig spent came out of their family coffers. With indulgences like this sumptuous chapel, festooned with pictures of France's Louis XIV, Ludwig was running through their entire fortune. In a single generation, he would fritter away what 800 years of royalty had amassed. But the lord of Neuschwan's castle was unrepentant. To the contrary, the dreamers spent more. By 1879, Ludwig completed the Palace Linderhof, intended as another memorial to Louis XIV of France. Called a white Rococo confection, Linderhof might have startled residents of the French palace Trianon. It was an exact copy, set just 50 miles from Neuschwanstein. On a covert mission to France, the fairy tale king had copied the design. The Linderhof was only the second of 3 sumptuous residences Ludwig was building, and at his death, architects were drawing plans for more. For the royal romantic, Linderhof was a celestial retreat where he could cultivate his new obsession. This one would introduce scandal to the grievances mounting against Ludwig. Male lovers. This is the Munich actor Josef Kainz. He accompanied King Ludwig on vacations to Switzerland and met him for trysts at the Linderhof. There, the two would indulge in opium while enjoying the geometric intricacies of this Moorish kiosk. Ludwig had it transplanted intact from a park in Bohemia. Despite these treasures, Kainz found Ludwig boring. After 2 years, he left. But perhaps the young actor had grown frightened, for also at Linderhof is the striking and disturbing Venus Grotto. It is a cave set deep into the earth. To the uninitiated, it probably looked like the mouth of Hades. It was here Ludwig's love of drama finally drove him underground. Once again, stage decorators collaborated with architects to recreate the fantastic. In this case, a stage design for Wagner's Tannhäuser, as performed by the Munich Opera. Behind the gaudy facades, one machine made waves, another manufactured rainbows. Both were powered by the first electric plant to reach Bavaria. But the place is devoid of romance. A garish, subterranean tomb. After feeding swans brought to him from the castle's outdoor ponds, Ludwig would climb into the boat, which is shaped like a seashell. Then, usually alone, the sovereign king of Bavaria would have himself rowed round and round the eerie, artificial lake. By 1886, the king's detractors, his royal family, and government ministers had found their common purpose. Together, they manufactured evidence of the king's insanity, including entries in his diary that later proved to be forgeries. One of their more subtle stories was that the main stairway at Neuschwanstein was reserved for Ludwig's use alone. At the slightest violation of this rule, the king would fly into a most unkingly rage. This story, and others like it, were false. But the stairway did hold a special place in the king's heart. At the top of the Salzburg marble steps floats a glittering, star-filled sky. The central column of the staircase, a majestic date palm, appears to hold up the roof of heaven. A believer all his life, Ludwig must have felt that such a vision awaited him when this world's trials lay behind. He had just one more to endure. The king's enemies, abetted by psychiatrists, compiled an extensive psychological profile of Ludwig. They especially noted his romantic excesses. Their goal was to prove that the king was incapacitated by mental illness. To achieve it, they gathered interviews from dozens of people, few who'd actually had much contact with Ludwig, many with reason to resent him. No examination of the king was ever made. As for Ludwig, there's little doubt he foresaw the impending coup. Local townspeople even offered him a plan of escape, but the king seemed resigned to his fate. Shortly before the catastrophe, Ludwig wrote to the American author Lou Vanderpool, "Insults wound me so deeply that they disarm me. They force me to the ground, and I am sure they will one day destroy me. I am called a fool. Will God call me a fool when I am summoned before him?" Only in its final sad scene would Ludwig's life take on the epic proportions of the Wagnerian operas he so much admired. the heroes he had failed to emulate in deeds, he would now join in tragedy. June 10th. At 4 in the morning, a government commission seized the king at Neuschwanstein and sped him away to a prison at Berg Castle. They paused only to change horses. On the evening of June 12th, he went for a walk with his physician, Dr. von Guden, around Starnberg Lake. Earlier in the day, the doctor had remarked that the king seemed obedient, even willing to undergo treatment that would cure him. Mysteriously, as the two set out, von Guden dismissed the guards assigned to accompany them. His reasons for doing so are still the subject of heated speculation. King Ludwig II and Dr. von Guden were never seen alive again. A frantic search by the castle staff revealed the king's coat near the lake. Several hours later, the search party turned up his hat. Soon the bodies were discovered, drowned. To mark the spot, this cross was erected by the villagers of Leoni, Bavaria, faithful to their king to the end. Officially, Ludwig's death was ruled a suicide. The government swamped the press with evidence of his insanity before his body was cold. A few weeks later, Neuschwanstein was opened for tourism. Allegations of conspiracy persist to this day. To his beloved countrymen, their favorite king lives on through his extravagant creations. For us, his legacy is a blend of fantasy and tragedy that challenges the mind. As the king himself once wrote, "I want to remain forever an enigma to myself and to others."
In a place called Transylvania, a creature of consummate evil has survived half a millennia and shows no signs of declining. He began as a medieval prince, and the castles from which he reigned tell a tale of unspeakable horror. Join us as we explore the harrowing haunts of Vlad Tepes, the real-life inspiration for Bram Stoker's Dracula, next on Great Castles of Europe. Romania's Carpathian Mountains. This chilling wilderness on Europe's eastern frontier marks the border of a kingdom caught between history and horror. It used to be known as the land beyond the forest, Transylvania. Here, since the Middle Ages, stories of supernatural evil have thrived among its peasants, of a devil who grows stronger through abominable acts, and a region of darkness untouched by God. In the late 19th century, the Irish writer Bram Stoker became fascinated by these rumors. Trying to give this evil a name, he came to Transylvania. According to many accounts, he traced the rumors to the town of Brasov and a fortress of mysterious beauty known as Bran Castle. The locals refer to Bran as Dracula's castle. Since Stoker's novel was first published in 1897, droves of tourists have sought the creature's origins here. Romanian travel guides encourage it. For lovers of the macabre, the castle has become a site of homage. Yet the troubled spirit connected to this place is far more peculiar than most vampire seekers know. In life, his haunts included several castles. Among them, Braun is guilty by association, but mostly untainted by evil. The same cannot be said of the human inspiration for Stoker's Prince of Darkness. He was Vlad Tepes, literally Vlad the Impaler. In the middle of the 15th century, he was the Prince of Wallachia, a small buffer state caught up in the vicious wars between Hungary and the Ottoman Empire of the Turks. For a time, this Wallachian prince was a hero, a medieval knight, commended by the Pope himself for repelling the heathen invaders who threatened Europe. Yet history remembers him as a crusader whose time had passed, and for a reign of terror more disturbing than fiction. Vlad Tepes was born in Transylvania in 1431, the year Joan of Arc was burned at the stake, the twilight of the Age of Crusades. He was heir to the throne of neighboring Wallachia in a lineage founded by his grandfather Mircea the Great, crowned in 1386. From the tender age of 7, Vlad was tutored in the discipline of knighthood and the obligations of the Wallachian crown. His father had been named a Knight of the Order of the Dragon by the Holy Roman Emperor. For this, he bore the name Dragon, or Dracul. As his son, Vlad was sworn from birth to take up the sword for Christ. For nobles in these decades of peril, knighthood was no quaint tradition. It meant survival itself. The fearless horsemen of the Ottoman sultans swept steadily west in a chain of victories seemingly destined to swallow Europe. In 1453, the death knell of Christendom would roar across the continent, the fall of Constantinople. At just 14, Vlad himself was captured by the dreaded Turks while on a campaign across the Danube. For 4 long years, the boy was held to ensure an end to his father's raids. From his captors, Vlad learned contempt for life and the many uses of terror. With Dracul's son in chains, Wallachia was a mere stepping stone to the great empire of Hungary. The Ottomans raided its rich trade routes, preparing for their final thrust into Europe. Under the Muslim sword, all of Wallachia cried out for a savior. Brasov was the region's greatest prize, the crossroads for all trade passing between Europe and Asia Minor. In 1395, Vlad's own grandfather Mircea had won Brasov the right to charge a 3% tax on goods coming through the pass. From this tariff, Brasov's class of German merchants grew rich. In charge of enforcing the tariff and protecting the trade route was the magnificent castle Braun. Braun began as a crusader's fortress, built in the 12th century to repel Muslim invaders, using Brasov Pass to break through to Europe. Its life as a toll castle began with Mircea, who presented the fortress to Brasov, Transylvania. Braun's soldiers guarded passage of trade and collected the town's share of revenue. A constant stream of cotton, spices, and produce ensured Brasov's prosperity. Despite havoc wrought by the Turks, the town's rich merchants, called boyars, grew arrogant and greedy under the protection of imposing brawn. Befitting its role as a soldier's garrison, Braun has an interior that is stately and Spartan. The ground plan consists of 4 towers around an irregularly shaped courtyard. No more than 30 soldiers lived here at a time. In emergencies, a larger army could be mobilized from Brasov. To protect those inside, the roofs of the inner courtyard are steeply sloped. Enemy artillery was deflected away instead of penetrating the living quarters. The chaotic layout of Braun's towers and multi-level battlements derives from the castle's foundation. It was shaped to fit the rock on which the castle is built. The living mountain extends into Braun itself, remodeled in more recent times to serve as a vacation home for Romanian royalty. But Braun was too isolated. It probably held too many memories of the other royal family who controlled it 600 years ago. This is the document with which Vlad Tepes's grandfather, Mircea, granted power and privileges to Brasov and its protector, Castle Braun. In 1456, after years of imprisonment and exile, Walachia's princely protector was about to take the throne. Vlad Tepes's coronation took place here, at the ruined castle Târgovista, Walachia's capital and power center for the heirs of Mircea the Great. In the castle's great hall, Vlad, like his father and grandfather before him, was crowned Prince of Wallachia. High Christian pomp accompanied the crowning. From his ancestral palace Târgovista, Vlad would carry out most of his reign. Now, as the knight accepted the crown, the Turkish menace was at its peak. Vlad would become a folk hero in Wallachia for making the Turks pay for their crimes. But before launching his holy war, the prince had a grudge to settle with the region's aristocratic boyars. In his view, their influence threatened Wallachia's independence. He invited them to a celebration. The region's most prominent citizens attended, imagining that the young monarch sought their favor. Spirits ran high as they toasted their new puppet prince. Vlad had other plans. Accompanied by his personal army, he led the old and infirm to a public square. There, his soldiers impaled them on stakes driven into the ground. Before the elders had died from the excruciating torture, he forced the younger boyars, both men and women, on a 50-mile march to this eagle's nest high in the Carpathians. With them, Vlad made a human chain, reaching from the Arjus River to the site of the now ruined castle Poyanar. There, his grandfather, Mircea, had built a foundation. With the nobles as slave labor, Vlad completed it. By then, 200 boyars would all be dead, impaled, killed by frost, or fallen from the Carpathian summit. As his reign began, Poyanar was Vlad's hideout, manned by soldiers numbering in the hundreds. Its walls were reinforced with brick to withstand cannon fire from the enemies he would make as prince. Now just 25, Vlad's plans for Wallachia and himself were truly visionary. From his castle strongholds, the courageous prince intended to win Wallachian independence from the empires that dominated it, Hungary and the Ottoman Turks. a free nation would emerge, unlike any in Europe, until the Middle Renaissance. The prince, whose official seals are seen here, would be accepted as a great European ruler. Wallachia would be free of its tormentors. Central to Vlad's goal were commercial toll castles like Braun. For Vlad, the revenue they protected was the other key to his small kingdom's independence. Vlad enforced law and order on the region's trade routes by punishing thieves with impalement. His use of terror began to seem arbitrary, even sadistic. Within 50 years, the Italian Niccolo Machiavelli would coach European monarchs in the judicious use of violence with his book, The Prince. Some claim Tepish was the inspiration for the classic treatise on power. But Machiavelli never went this far. Around 1458, Tepish began the years of raids that brought him fame as the Cross's staunchest defender. His personal war against the Turks was characterized by lightning attacks, reckless bravery in battle, and savagery that awed allies and foes alike. At the start of this era, Pope Pius II praised the Christian Crusaders' successes. By its end, Rome and the civilized world had distanced themselves from the uncontrollable prince on their frontier. In 1461, after a raid on the Turkish fortress Giurgiu, Vlad took thousands of Turks prisoner. These, along with up to 20,000 Germans, Bulgarians, and even Wallachians, he impaled on high stakes near his capital, Târgovista. When the Ottoman Sultan Mohammed II arrived for battle months later, the horrifying forest of corpses was still there. He turned his armies around, saying, "What can we do against a man capable of this?" By 1460, the Turks had a special name for the son of Dracul, Kaziklubae, the Impaler. Yet the prince's excesses weren't saved for Turks alone. He impaled foreign ambassadors for imagined insults, German students accused of spying, lovers for alleged infidelity. By the end of his reign, he'd murdered 100,000 of his own countrymen, a full 1/5 of the Wallachian population. One harrowing account is backed by Russian, German, and Romanian sources. According to them, Vlad invited hundreds of Wallachian sick and poor to a lavish banquet near Târgovista. When the prince asked what else would please them, they answered, "Relief from our pain and want." Vlad ordered the hall locked from outside and set on fire. By 1462, King Matthias of Hungary had heard enough. Wallachia was a principality in his domain. The Impaler was his burden. He ordered his generals to seize Tepish at any cost. But now Vlad was headed for them. With a small band of followers, he had fled Wallachia and was on the run to Transylvania, with the legions of Mohammed the Conqueror hard on his heels. They crossed the Danube, then this bluff, their horses shod backwards to throw off pursuers. Tepish no doubt was overjoyed to see the armies of his old ally, Matthias. He may even have thought they had come as reinforcements. Instead, they put the madman in chains. he was imprisoned somewhere in Transylvania, perhaps even Braun Castle. His second internment lasted 12 years, and during this time, the trail of Vlad Tepes, the historical Dracula, grows dim. Historical records indicate he returned to the throne to help Matthias repel another wave of Ottoman invaders. Other sources claim he died in his mountain prison or escaped. At Braun Castle, he might have used one of the fortress's little-known features, a secret passage Vlad copied at his castle Pojaniar. In Braun's inner courtyard, hidden beneath a well, is a steep staircase. If Vlad used it, he would have emerged in the forest below the castle. This could account for atrocities attributed to him during his years in prison and long after his supposed death. It's likely that Vlad died as he lived, around 1477, in a final battle against the Turks. His head, some claim, was sent to the Sultan, proof that the impaler was dead. But because of his deeds in life, Wallachians had a hard time accepting his death. Rumors of his nocturnal murders continued. Soon the legend of the impaler merged with tales of that particularly Eastern European creature, the vampire. Long before Vlad's time, peasants strung garlic from the doors of their homes. Burial sites were surrounded by stakes to ensure safety from a rapacious evil that survived beyond the grave. German publishers fueled the impaler's fame. As early as 1499, pamphlets appeared recounting the prince's barbarity against Walachia's boyars. By now, the impaler had taken on the chilling name he's known by today, Dracula, meaning both son of Dracul and the devil. Not even the prince's burial brought relief to the region's peasantry. This is Snagov Lake in Wallachia, now Romania. On its uninhabited island, just one structure exists, a monastery containing the tomb of Dracula. At the height of his career, Dracula had the monastery erected that it might somehow atone for his sins. Inside is a single grave, horrifyingly empty. In this century, repeated excavations have turned up only fragments. The implications are all too clear. According to legend, on the day he was buried, a fierce storm raged. The wind tore the chapel from its foundation and blew it into the lake. To this day, peasants say that whenever the waters of Snagov get agitated, one can hear the chapel bell tolling at the bottom of the lake. This is what Braun Castle looked like in the years Bram Stoker could have seen it, as the 19th century shuddered to a close. If Stoker used Braun as a model for Dracula's castle, he exaggerated its features, but captured its essence. His character, Jonathan Harker, writes, "All of a sudden I was aware that the driver was holding the horses on the court of a vast ruin of a castle. We saw it in all its grandeur, perched 1,000 feet on the summit of a sheer precipice. There was something wild and uncanny about the place." Stoker's genius lay in reuniting Romanian and German folk tales with their source, the historical Dracula. Were it not for the novel's phenomenal success, Stoker and his other tales of horror might have remained anonymous. Yet it is hard to believe that the otherworldly character of this part of Romania would have stayed out of sight forever. Somehow the legacy of the medieval Wallachian prince would have exerted itself. Bram Stoker's Professor Van Helsing describes the vampire in terms that make a fitting epitaph for the real-life Prince of Darkness. "The undead do not die like a bee when he sting once. His cunning be the growth of ages. He is only stronger, and being stronger has yet more power to work evil."